Mutation. It is the key to our evolution. It has enabled us to evolve from a single-celled organism into the dominant species on the planet. This process is slow, normally taking thousands and thousands of years. But every few hundred millennia, evolution leaps forward.
At the dawn of the universe, there was nothing. Then, boom. Big Bang sent 6 elemental crystals hurtling across the virgin universe. These infinity stones each control an essential aspect of existence.
Space, reality, power, soul, mind, and time.
It's a good chance you're very familiar with these clips and the characters upon which they're based. Probably even more so if you're watching this video and subscribe to my channel, which if you're not, and I realize I'm new at YouTube and the production quality here is a little behind the curve, but I promise to make up for it with fun, whimsy, and content for now, and then higher quality production down the line. So any support you'd care to give would be great, even if that's subscribing and setting the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos, which would be a good thing because this is only part 1 of a 3-part series on this subject. But getting back to our subject, comic characters like the X-Men, Doctor Strange, and Guardians of the Galaxy are more than just names and events told through picture books. I know, right? Though you may not have actually ever thought about it, comics are super unique in the sense that they are America's primary contribution to the landscape of mythology. In other words, 1,000 years from now, people will look back on American mythology and learn about characters like Captain America, Iron Man, and Batman or Superman in the very same way that we explore Greek, Roman, and even Germanic gods. For that matter, even historical religious figures like Jesus of Nazareth or St. Peter of Rome. Hell, for all we know, thousands of years from now, Thor in America's mythology might completely supplant the original Norse mythology in terms of how people view and retell the story of Thor and the fellow Norse gods.
Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor.
But before we get into any of that, it's first important that we define mythology not just from a linguistic sense, but it's also important that we couch these terms within the fields of sociology, history, and even religious studies. Because of their variability, mythology and mythological studies might be one of the most diverse fields within academia itself. It's not all that often one subject can be explored so intently from a variety of different aspects. One could argue that mythology and religion come in second only to maths in terms of their academic diversity. When it comes to the definition of myth, we're going to avoid the problematic definition Oxford uses, where they use the word to define the word, but instead we're going to tweak it ever so slightly and say, mythology is a collection of works, especially belonging to a particular religious or cultural tradition. Or separately, a set of stories or beliefs about a particular person, institution, or situation, especially when exaggerated or fictitious. And that's from Oxford. Now, David Provalny, whom we'll discuss at length in just a moment, quotes noted anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski's definition of myth in his article, Comics as the Modern American Mythology for Ad Americum, Journal of Scientific American Studies, as a statement of primeval reality, which still lives in present-day life. and as a justification by precedent, supplies a retrospective pattern of moral values, sociological order, and magical belief. Myth is, therefore, an indispensable ingredient of all culture. It is, as we've seen, constantly regenerated. Every historical change creates its own mythology. Now, that last particular bit will become important later, but for now, let's just remember his assertion that if a cultural social change happens, it must be accompanied by a mythology reinterpretation.
His people did not call him general or king. They called him Kukul Khan, the feather serpent god. Killing him will risk eternal war.
Now, in another video in this series, we'll see how that quote will actually draw some interesting comparisons to Christianity and Judaism. But for now, we're going to wrap up this definition of myth by quoting Niles Crane's favorite psychologist, Carl Jung, when he said, "Myth is what is believed always, everywhere, by everybody." I think that's a good place to end on myth. It's a good time to define comics. It's probably important to denote the difference between a comic and a comic book. This particular distinction is a small, but it's a pretty important one, and I'm going to let the late great Stan Lee describe the difference between the two, at least according to him. Quote, "People always write it as if it's two separate words, but to me, if it's two separate words, then it means a funny book, a comic book. If you write it as one word, which is the way that I do it, then it's a generic term meaning a comic book. So I feel everybody ought to write it comic book as if it's one word, because it doesn't mean funny book." Now, I get what he's trying to say here, because generally speaking, a comic is a smaller, often 1 to 4 panel strip meant to break down a thought or an idea into a finely distilled point. The most effective comics could often get this done with just a single picture. We still do things like this today in things like New Yorker, Harper's Weekly. They even still exist on the comic front pages with stuff like Family Circus or even the great Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy. Which I know the girl name is Olivia who's doing it now, but I can't remember her last name. But all of these serves as great examples of this model. Comic books, on the other hand, are often 22 pages detailing one or more story involving a titular hero going on some quest, usually against a villain, in search of truth, justice, and the American way.
I mean, why are you here? There must be a reason for you to be here.
Yes, I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
You're gonna end up fighting every elected official in this country.
Speaking of truth, justice, and the American way, it's these very ideas that actually make up the backbone of American comics. In fact, the entire myth of the American dream is baked into some of comics' greatest legends. Iron Man and Batman are both obscenely rich and have seemingly had more sex with women than John Holmes. In fact, Iron Man's so dedicated to the American ethos that he even develops alcoholism and gains sobriety through another fine American institution, Alcoholics Anonymous, which I am not talking down on. When the money wasn't being presented as the American dream, you could often find patriotism taking its place. Captain America exists quite literally as the figurehead for this movement. He gained popularity in their 1940s, when the United States was leading the charge for the Allies in World War II. And he's been featured as one of Marvel's key characters even leading into 2023. Fans might be familiar with this dynamic from the critically acclaimed Captain America Winter Soldier.
For once, we're way ahead of the curve. By holding a gun to everyone on Earth and calling it protection.
You know, I read those SSR files. Greatest Generation? You guys did some nasty stuff.
Yeah, we compromised, sometimes in ways that made us not sleep so well. But we did it so that people could be free. This isn't freedom. This is freedom.
So we can sort of round out this segment by going back to the dude that got us started with truth, justice, and the American way. Superman, who sits at an interesting crossroads in his life, given that he was founded on the ideal American, which at the time was an immigrant who uses his skills to the betterment of everyone around him. It's just whether or not that ideal still exists is what's up for debate. Which is exactly what I'm talking about when I mention cultural and societal reinterpretations following major events. But that's still for a later time. For now, it's time to talk about comics and how they're uniquely American in more than just one way. You see, we've already discussed how comics convey their message through finely distilled and easily understood points. And these were often told through images, right? Now, why do you think that is so popular here in America? A lot of Americans love pictures. Are they too dumb to read?
Just when I think you couldn't possibly be any dumber.
No. Not even a little bit, not even at all. This actually comes from the idea that this country has already been hardwired for pictures through the film industry. While oral traditions are and were extremely popular in Europe and across ancient history, in fact, much of history's really honestly favored great orators over the written word because it was a combination of facts, usually told from a specific point of view, but it was often mixed with theater and a grand delivery. I mean, it's pretty easy to see how this became the go-to method for people who loved a good movie. But comics were around before the advent of motion pictures. So what gives? Again, these things were created out of the unique American immigrant experience. Funny pictures were often slapped in periodicals as a way of relaying things to a community of people who didn't always speak the native language, but could understand the gist of a simple comic. Yes, many of them were poorly educated and thus could not read or write, but that did not mean they were dumb. And it certainly didn't mean that they couldn't understand complex ideas. People just had to figure out a way to communicate these ideas in an effective and simple manner. So, naturally, the idea of using pictures led to comics because that's the natural progression of things. And it's certainly the natural progression of satire. It's going to use the form most common to it. Think about it like this. How many different times have you heard a movie star or famous figure, possibly even a comedian, giving an interview where they state either seriously or jokingly, while trying to relay a serious story, that they learned English from some sort of comedy show? It's still something we see today. The wonderful Ana de Armas recently talked about learning English through friends in her SNL monologue. Check it out.
Gracias, muchas gracias. He tenido un año increíble y estoy muy feliz de estar aquí presentando el programa de esta noche. I speak English, but I didn't when I first got to the U.S. I was born in Cuba, came to America when I was 26, and I learned English the way everyone who comes to this country does, by watching Friends.
I'd say it's not just a modern thing. I mean it. People of a certain vintage and awesomeness might remember this little clip from an American classic.
You know, if you guys got a break, you could really make it.
Yeah, and if a frog had wings, it wouldn't bump his ass when he hopped.
Interesting. Where did you learn English?
College. And the Police Academy movies.
Publications like Frank Leslie's Illustrated, the New York Daily Graphic, or even the aforementioned Harper's Weekly all use this idea to reach larger audiences unfamiliar with the English language. And ultimately, because these comics were for the people, they eventually became commandeered and perfected by the people. It shouldn't be surprising that cultures raised on picture books and comics became so prolific at writing them. Jewish families came from all sorts of non-English speaking countries in the 18 and 1900s. Same with Irish families, same with Italian families. So a guy like Stanley Martin Lieber becoming Stan Lee makes perfect sense. And if you know anything about why Stan Lee changed his name, it also makes perfect sense when talking about that American dream. Also, comics and mythology as well. So, seeing these ideas work together in tandem really starts to explain how comics became so popular here in America, and hopefully this can start to change your perspective just a little on how you see them all together. It's actually a perfect segue to kind of wrap things up, because this all leads to the final point I want to impart upon you before we pick up the subject in part 2 a little bit more in depth. And that is that comics are also a really important tool for reflecting nearly every event in our American history. In fact, many of these events will become absolutely critical in a future video when we take a look at mythological reinterpretation following major events. But for right now, just think about how many different origin stories some of your favorite characters have had, and how many of them were tied to real-world events. Off the top of my head, a couple that I can think of include Iron Man's origin going from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Same with Frank Castle, the Punisher.
Country, I was a soldier here. Did what you asked me to, it was wrong in you. Country, I'm just a stranger to you. A number, a name, it's true, throw me when you're through. Home of the brave and the free, the red, white, and blue. Well, I wish it was true.
Sure. Enemies in the comics went from having an evil Russian bent to having an evil Islamic extremist or some other kind of country terrorist bent. The Civil War event reflected the growing divide between Democrats and Republicans in the early 2000s. And that's just what I can come up with sitting here and doing some quick thinking or one or two Google searches. All of this is to highlight that the line between stuff like Roman gods and the Marvel gods is actually a lot thinner than you may realize. And over the course of the next 2 videos, we're really going to dive into the specifics of how comics like DC, Marvel, and Star Wars serve as the true American modern mythology. So I want to thank you guys a ton for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Aside from the 2 other segments for this series, I'm also planning on releasing a series of interviews with many academics and noted YouTubers in the field of mythology, religious studies, atheism, all here on Gospel of Galactus. I do hope you'll stick around and support the channel, but until next time, this has been Why Comics Are the Modern American Mythology Part 1. Right here on Gospel of Galactus, man. I'm Kane Webb, and I'm reminding you guys, stay hungry for knowledge.